Thank you, Yat, so much for joining us. Let me start with Animoca Brands. And you had quite some interesting Web3 investments in Q3 2024. We're talking about the most active Web3 investment entity in Q3 with over 200 investments. Can you walk us through a couple of these investments and tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. Actually, Animoca Brands' total portfolio is actually over 540 companies today. And actually, we ended up basically believing in the space quite early in 2018. And so this year, we continue to participate and invest in many sort of growth areas. Obviously, gaming is a big area for us. Also, DePIN, AI, of course, and broadly infrastructure. We started off really as a company focused on entertainment and culture. And now everything that we're investing in Web3 is how to build and grow that ecosystem even larger. So obviously, we're also doing things like in reputation and also on education. So generally in everything, I could say.
Well, let's double click in one of those one by one. First of all, about gaming, what's happening. You know, a big complaint about Web3 gaming over the last couple of years was that Web3 gaming was not fun. It was not interesting. Yes, it was decentralized, but it was not exciting. What's your view as an investor in the space of where Web3 gaming is going? And do you think that things may change over the next couple of months or years?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think Web3 gaming has come really sort of a long way, right? So in the early days, when you think about games like Axie Infinity, for instance, and even the early versions of Sandbox, they're kind of like mobile gaming 2010, 2011, right? And remember, a lot of people were saying, oh, that's not that much fun. The sort of, gamer that was playing console games was like, oh, I wouldn't play those games. But later on, actually, what happened was that these games got better. And, it takes a few years to make these games become sort of commercially great. And that's actually what's happening right now. And so you have really a few narratives. The first narrative is the growth narrative, which is that things like Ton and Telegram have actually accelerated the ability for blockchain games to actually become reality. So, for instance, Apple, most people don't realize, Apple does not allow NFTs inside games because they say that you can have an NFT, but you can't have utility. So that means avenues like these, in Steam has completely banned NFTs, for instance, as well, right? So as a result, the discovery for these games, even if they were good, was hard. Right? So that's now been solved somewhat with what's happening with sort of Ton and Telegram. And of course, the other one, of course, is that Epic, the Epic Game Store, famously being deplatformed from Apple, as you realize, right? Fortnite is not available in some markets from the Apple App Store because basically they view them as competitors, really. They've now allowing NFTs inside games, and one of the biggest games in sort of the gaming world, not even specifically around sort of blockchain, is actually a blockchain game called Off the Grid by Godzilla, which is also one of our portfolios. And you can, most people outside don't really realize that it's actually a Web3 game and that there's a tokenization element in it. So that's kind of one element. So you can kind of see in the mid to sort of hardcore gaming direction where that's going. That's kind of one. But then on the casual gaming side, applications like Gamey, for instance, or, where there's Cadison or Hamster Combat, I mean, they are all signing up hundreds of millions of users more on the casual gaming side. So you kind of see that developing as well. So the growth of the space happening. And then also now Sandbox basically launched the Alpha Season 4. Basically, people are going back into the game and being able to engage with hundreds and hundreds of experiences, which is more similar to like a Minecraft and Roblox. Right? And so I think, a year ago, we said it would take about 12 to 18 months to sort of get to that point. And we're kind of now here at this moment where I think hundreds of millions of new users will go into Web3 because of gaming.
So this is interesting. This is what I want to ask about, is the consumer adoption. Because when you look at the global gaming industry, there are a couple of challenges, and we're seeing it with big corporations. So to what extent are you seeing more consumer adoption to blockchain gaming and Web3 gaming? And to what extent do you think that there is more room to grow? And what factors do you think are going to be drivers of this growth?
Well, first, I think the major markets where Web3 gaming is actually happening mostly in Asia and actually regions like the Middle East. So the US and Europe, to some extent, has had a more muted response to Web3 gaming. And I think it has a large part to do with the fact that people weren't comfortable with the financial elements inside those games, even though trading of gaming assets, when you think about like Counter-Strike, has been around since forever. But for a lot of the traditional gamers, particularly in the West, they view it kind of a little more negatively. And I think it has a lot to do with the Westerners' perspective on capitalism, which we know is somewhat under siege, actually, in this particular era for the last few years. Whereas in Asia, for instance, in the Middle East, we're all very happy capitalists, right? We understand the value of money. We think it's important. And that's also partially because our generation, certainly my parents' generation, never even had any property to begin with, right? And so, some people, for instance, some of the biggest gaming markets in the world, like South Korea, for instance. Actually, South Korea had a GDP that was lower than North Korea 40 years ago. And today, it's the 12th or 13th largest sort of economy in the world, one of the major gaming hubs in the world, and almost every major gaming studio is looking at blockchain or NFTs inside their games or launching some kind of Web3 game, in stark contrast to the West. right? So when you look at it from an American lens, you say NFT games is dead. But when you look from an Asian sense, you say it's rising and growing and exciting.
هذا البرنامج برعاية فينيكس جروب UAE.
We're back here with Yat Siu, chairman of Animoca Brands. Yat, we've had an exciting conversation so far. I really want to focus on a couple of things you mentioned. What is the rise of DePIN? You mentioned it's one of the areas of focus you're focused on. How do you see DePIN, and what element of DePIN is really you think provides a great game-changing potential for the Web3 space?
Well, I mean, I think generally speaking, when you talk about DePIN, right, and RWA is really as a construct, it's really about sort of how do you bridge essentially physical, real-life interactions into the world of Web3, and what value does it benefit, sort of create. And really the value of putting something is decentralized ownership, for instance, and mass participation, and creating an incentive framework where the end user who's actually providing the infrastructure, whether this is, for instance, data infrastructure or file infrastructure or compute infrastructure. These are all actually elements that you now as an end user get benefits for because essentially in a DePIN type of infrastructure. So I wouldn't say there's a particular area, as in, we've invested in companies that do compute, we've invested in companies that do file storage, we've invested in companies that basically sort of, basically do AI, for instance, in terms of ownership of the AI models. These are all forms of DePIN that actually you can sort of create. It's just that actually you as an end user also have a better understanding as to what it means as well. So we see that also as a natural bridge. It's like, oh, okay, I understand if I share my Wi-Fi, for instance, or if I share my data, or if I share my sort of, connection of some sort that I have, then there's a benefit I should be receiving. That's difficult to do in the physical world, but in the tokenized Web3 world, it's actually much easier to scale.
So, let me ask you something we've been watching really closely here in the region for quite a while, and especially in the UAE, which is IPOs, especially for companies such as yours.
Right.
How far is it going to be before we see your company as a publicly listed company in the Middle East or GCC? Because I think a lot of investors are really interested.
Yes. So, I mean, this is a common question that we get. I think it's not a secret that Animoca Brands is eventually going to be back as a public company. We were once listed before. And so we think this is something that's going to happen over the next several years. And this region is one of the ones that is most forward in Web3. We also have a lot of partnerships, a lot of strategic investors here, including Saudi Arabia, as well as in UAE. So it makes a lot of sense for us. We're headquartered in Hong Kong, but as you may know, Hong Kong has actually sort of now created particularly with the Saudi, a specific sort of direct partnership and relationship as well. So again, I would say, the partnership between our region and this region makes sense for us to consider potentially even something that could potentially look like a dualistic. But of course, that's in the future. We can't go into too many specifics.
So it's not something that we can expect in 2025?
No, I think the preparation for an IPO does take somewhere between 12 to 18 months. And I think there's a number of steps that we need to complete. However, I think we've seen some good models. I think in the US, when you look at, for instance, Coinbase, has demonstrated actually what the potential is. And really, what is Coinbase? Yes, it's an exchange, but actually it's become a kind of index for people who want to participate in Web3, and if they can't essentially buy sort of, direct projects, then what they'll end up doing is they might buy the equity in a project, in a company that's exposed in the ecosystem. And I think, the fact that we have 540 portfolio companies, the fact that we are one of probably the largest, certainly in the Web3 NFT space, is another way for investors to sort of partake in this, which is part of our mission, right? We want to create more awareness and more mass adoption. And actually, that is one way to do it. You don't just have to buy the project directly. You could actually be involved in us and have exposure to the Web3 ecosystem.
Yet you are mentioning a lot of keywords here that we keep discussing, me and Henri, on Crypto Weekly. Reputation, credibility, institutional backing.
Right.
But all of these are tied to a very stable and credible regulatory system. So to what extent do you think that the regulatory environment overall is evolving as fast as the blockchain industry?
So normally when it comes to regulation, it always tends to lag behind because it tends to follow, it has to. And I think there's always this fine balance of sort of regulation and innovation, right? If you basically over-regulate, then you hurt that area of innovation. Yes. One of the powerful things, though, around blockchain, though, is that it actually has a way in which you can really self-regulate quite well. For instance, blockchain is actually very, very transparent, if you think about that, right? Everything's on chain. So if you do a transaction on chain, you can track that. But are we actually amending or working through the laws in a way where we can take advantage of these areas? And same, for instance, this issue, for instance, when you look at Europe, right? When you look at GDPR, many of the policies around essentially sort of, your data and your data privacy. But actually, in reality, blockchain and ZK knowledge actually can solve all of that, right? So again, I see blockchain as a way of solving these problems, but it comes with education. And so part of our job and many in our industry is to educate regulators. And again, this region here, Dubai, is actually very advanced in this one. I think you have one of the most forward sort of areas of regulation and thought around this. And it's also the reason why your city is thriving. And, there is an interesting parallel as well. The places around the world that are actually welcoming the Web3 industry actually tend to do very well. So, for instance, you look at the US. What is the center of the US? The US is kind of struggling economically, but the center of basically the Web3 world is Miami. And Miami is the fastest growing place in America, for instance, right? Dubai, Hong Kong, right? Singapore, right? So there is a correlation here. If you basically do it correctly, you will benefit from it.
But Yat, as we finish the interview, I mean, maybe on a more personal level,
right.
You've been very successful with many ventures over the years, and now obviously you're the head of a multi-billion-dollar value in the company. At a personal level, what have you found the most interesting or unique of leading a company in the Web3 space compared to other businesses and other industries you've been in the past?
I mean, there's so much, but I think one of the areas that I love about Web3 is the fact that it is about building a shared network, right? So in the Web2 world, it is very zero-sum because you're basically trying to build a monopoly in basically elbowing people out. But in Web3, because it's permissionless, the token infrastructures are interconnected. It's kind of like a rising tide lifts all boats. So for instance, regardless of which layer 1, layer 2, which gaming project, if it becomes bigger, the entire ecosystem benefits. Remember back in 21, 22, when Sandbox and Axie Infinity were doing incredibly well, it actually fueled the GameFi revolution, right? It actually provided basically fuel for every other project that's out there. And the same is true today. When Bitcoin ETFs came out and Bitcoin was doing well, again, it basically fueled the entire industry. In Web2, that's not true, right? If Apple does really well, it's not really good for Google. It's certainly not good for Facebook, for instance, right? If Fortnite really explodes in its usage, it doesn't make any difference to any other game out there. People don't benefit from that. And so I think this is this sort of framework of sort of, where we can really build something in a shared way together, which is actually, I think, how we as humans are more naturally attuned. I don't know, if society was actually as zero-sum as the business people of the older generations would like us to believe, then we were all basically ripping ourselves apart. But that's actually not how we are, right? We're actually much more sort of wanting to help others. And that's actually, I think, the natural framework of Web3.
Thank you so much, Yat, for being with us. It's been great having you, Yat Siu, Chairman of Animoca Brands. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.